Hello, and welcome to TropeTok. I'm one of your hosts, Abby.
I'm Aria.
I'm Rose.
And we have the brilliant Eliza on editing. We are a limited series podcast examining and deconstructing common tropes in literature and other media. But first, what is a trope? You've very likely heard about tropes before. But, just in case you haven't, tropes are common, sometimes stereotypical characters, character arcs, plots, or stereotypes. Say, for example, the jock or the cheerleader character tropes in high school movies, or the chosen one in fantasy, or enemies to lovers or slow burn in romance. Now, these are not strict delineations. Often similar tropes exist across genres and they change over time, because as our society changes, so do the stories we tell ourselves. Tropes contain subtextual, or not-so-subtextual, implications for readers or viewers. Often they reflect and perpetuate the views and values of the society they function within. For an audience that does not discern this fact, these values are transplanted into their subconscious without them realizing. This is especially the case with young, impressionable audiences. This is why it's so important to engage critically with the media we consume, whether that's books, television, or film, and to recognize these tropes and have a working understanding of where they come from, how and why they're popularly used, and ultimately what values they support or represent. This is TropeTok.
In this episode, we will be focusing on tropes relating to female characters and ideals of femininity. We will specifically be discussing 1. The Manic Pixie Dream Girl, a love interest defined by her quirkiness and the way that she changes the male protagonist's life. 2. The Tomboy, a young rambunctious girl whose behavior or personality are non-traditionally feminine. And 3. The Cool Girl, an idealized love interest that reflects all the male protagonist's interests and values.
Just as a quick trigger warning for this episode, we will be talking about topics such as sexism, some aspects of racism, and profanity.
So what is a Manic Pixie Dream Girl? The term was first used in 2007 by Nathan Rabin in a discussion of the 2005 film Elizabethtown, who said that she, quote, exists solely in the fevered imaginations of sensitive writer-directors to teach the broodingly soulful young men to embrace life and its infinite mysteries and adventures. She's recognized by her odd fashion sense and her quirky mannerisms and the fact that she turns around our sad boy protagonist's life before disappearing from it completely. She's recognized by these things because she doesn't really have a personality outside of that. Rabin has since expressed regrets for having coined the term. As the critic world and ultimately the general public took this phrase and ran with it, it morphed into being considered a sexist phrase itself rather than one aimed at calling out the sexism of underdeveloped female characters who are only there to change a more complex man's life. The term only started appearing in the 2000s, but the Manic Pixie Dream Girl has existed for much longer than that. While it was conceived of in that initial review, it rose to prominence through a subsequent post on the same website listing other characters who seemingly fit the trope, including Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's and Diane Keaton in Annie Hall. Jennifer Goch has outlined key points that fall into the Manic Pixie Dream Girl's story. It starts with the sad white boy protagonist's introduction as we learn how mundane and boring and sad his life is. Then we meet the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, and she's cool and mysterious and weird, but she's conventionally attractive, albeit with an odd sense of fashion, so it's acceptable. Next, the Manic Pixie Dream Girl and the sad boy go on adventures together, and she teaches him how to live uninhibited by social norms. They have an argument at some point, and the girl disappears from the narrative for a bit, and usually something is revealed about her. Finally, she comes back, they make up, and then she leaves again with our sad boy's life forever changed. I bring this up because this is just as much a story structure trope as it is a character trope. The Manic Pixie Dream Girl is only a Manic Pixie Dream Girl as long as she fills that particular role in her story. Outside of her surface level weirdness, the Manic Pixie Dream Girl doesn't really have depth to her character. This is why subversions fall flat. As soon as she does, she's not a Manic Pixie Dream Girl anymore. She's just a woman in fiction who happens to have dyed hair and or wear vintage clothing with a bubbly personality. In his latest piece detailing his thoughts on the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, Nathan Rabin has pointed out the role that neurodivergence has played in her characterization and story, contributing to the romanticization of neurodivergent traits, but not of neurodivergence itself. He points out that They're college and 20-something flings that are fondly remembered rather than permanent partners, going on to talk about how it's easier to embrace the more cutesy traits of hers and undergo personal growth through them than it is to be there long-term through some of the more challenging facets of being neurodivergent in this world. We seldom see the latter side of this character because she tends to lose her charm once she gains her humanity, because ultimately she's a male fantasy, and male fantasies don't tend to include real humans. All right, now that we have a bit of background, let's jump into the discussion.
So, Rose, one thing that you brought up in your introduction that I'm really interested in, but I haven't really read a lot about, is this idea of neurodivergence in the Manic Pixie Dream Girl character. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So, part of what draws people to the Manic Pixie Dream Girl is she's different. She's very uninhibited by social norms and tends to have traits that are coded as neurodivergent.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It was a little bit difficult for me to research this part of this podcast just because I've consumed a lot of media with Manic Pixie Dream Girls, but I haven't really thought about them too heavily before. I really like the movie Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. I know that Ramona Flowers is often cited as an example of, I think the acronym is MPDG, or just the Pixie. I know she's pretty popular. I'm also a huge fan of the movie Fight Club from 1999, who has this character named Marla Singer, who's also, I think, coded as a pixie character. She sort of appears to our protagonist at a very low point in his life, and she's sort of this splash of color who really influences the course of the movie before she, like you said, disappears.
One really interesting topic that I came upon when I was researching was, first of all, this distinction of what exactly counts as a Manic Pixie Dream Girl, right? Because Rose was saying how a lot of the times now it's used in sexist discourse as a way to essentially just discount certain female characters, to just say, oh, she's just a Manic Pixie Dream Girl, and just leave it at that. And even like a lot of the most egregious examples that people will use of this misrepresentation are characters that have, you know, within popular culture been considered a Manic Pixie Dream Girl, even though the movies that they were in, they were like actively trying to subvert it. Think 500 Days of Summer, like Summer, or Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. I don't know, have you guys seen that movie?
I haven't seen either of those. Can you talk a little bit about what they are?
Yes. So in 500 Days of Summer, the entire movie is about how this main character, Joel, spends all of his time being really, really hung up over his breakup with this girl, Summer. And initially her introduction very much gives you Manic Pixie Dream Girl. She's quirky, she's interesting. You know, he's very much our sad boy white protagonist. But the entire movie takes place after they've already broken up, so we are seeing it entirely through his perspective. And even though, in a sense, it almost fails to do this because this did not land with a lot of audiences, the thing that the movie was trying to do was to show you how much Joel had romanticized their relationship to the point where he was never listening to the things that she was saying, because she was very clearly saying throughout the relationship that she wasn't interested in this, she wasn't interested in that, and he never listened to those. And you can see that because at the end, they don't end up together. She ends up marrying someone else, someone that we don't even meet, because the point isn't that who she ends up with, it's that it's not Joel, because that wasn't what she wanted. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind also takes place after they have broken up. And this one's a bit sci-fi fantasy. It's about being able to erase your memory. And so this guy, he's so heartbroken over the breakup that he starts trying to erase his memory of her. But there's a line near the beginning that literally calls out this trope so explicitly, because she says, every guy thinks that I'm going to come in and save him and that I'm going to change his life, but I'm not here to do that. I'm just a effed up girl looking for my peace of mind. Don't assign me yours. But once again, this movie is cited as a classic example of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. A lot of the examples that I saw, and a lot of what I see this character used as and viewed as in media as sort of like a shorthand, is as a tool in the storytelling trope for development of other characters. And one of the things that I was trying to think of when I was reading through this trope was who's that tool for and who is being used as a tool. One of the articles that I ended up reading, it's titled "The Manic Pixie Dream Girl in United States YA Fiction," kind of goes over this fact that most Manic Pixie Dream Girls are presented as white, cisgender, heterosexual, and middle class, very specifically. And it's a really interesting thing to notice, because another fact that she points out is that a lot of these tropes that we associate with the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, this sort of like neurodivergence or loudness, boldness, style of dress, is very quirky on white women, but when applied to other races or even gender presentations, reads in a very different way. One of the instances that they point out in the article is this idea of streaks of dyed hair on white girls being quirky and young, and on other characters like black women being more ghetto, is what they use in the article. So when we bring in this sort of extra lens of what does it mean to present, first of all, a character in a source of media as a tool, and then defining who that tool is for, and then defining what that tool is made out of. Which is a really interesting, I spent a lot of time just thinking like behind the scenes of this episode of what it sort of does to you to see this trope sort of reduced. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
So this perspective, it isn't something I hadn't necessarily thought of specific to this trope, because quite honestly, it's something I think of within media as a whole, in a sense that quite honestly, especially like when I was growing up, I was just not used to seeing people of color or people of any like non-binary gender presentations in media at all. I know that that's something that's changing, that it's improving now, but in a sense, this like cis white, straight, middle class lens is just the lens that the majority of media was made from for a very long time. But speaking about the Manic Pixie Dream Girl specifically, the thing that I've noticed often, and the way that it's used, and I think the reason that the critic who coined the term regrets it now, is because, the Manic Pixie Dream Girl in of herself is a tool, like you said, just there to, improve the male character's life. And there was I can't remember where I read this or saw this, I think it was a YouTube video by The Take, but they were talking about how the idea actually manifests from a much older, much more, I guess, pure idea of the muse, like the goddesses of the muses, the goddesses of the arts, who would inspire men, obviously, of course, but still who would inspire men to make art, to make beauty, to do all of those things, and that is like the initial idea where it came from, and that has morphed into what we know today. But in a lot of ways, it's also turned into this term that's used to reduce complex female characters, because a lot of times she won't be a Manic Pixie Dream Girl, but she'll be labeled as that due entirely to these small characteristics, the dyed hair, the quirky attitude, piercings, makeup, I don't know.
Yeah, I think those ideas are very important.
All right, let's move on to our next topic.
Wiktionary defines a tomboy as referring to girls or young women with masculine traits, which may include wearing androgynous or unfeminine clothing and engaging with physical sports or other activities and behaviors usually associated with boys or men. Some popular tomboys in literary and film history include Annabelle Andrews, who's the daughter from Freaky Friday, Misty from the Pokemon franchise, Arya Stark from Game of Thrones, and Laura Ingalls from Little House on the Prairie. Now, according to the Oxford Dictionary of English, tomboy as a word has existed since the early 1500s and used to refer to boisterous young men, but it really only took on the meaning that we know today, spirited, rebellious young girls, in the early 1600s, which is still over 400 years ago. And while tomboyism has been around for literally hundreds of years, like many literary tropes, the popularity of tomboys in media has a lot to do with the popularity of tomboys in real life. Originally, the promotion of tomboys in the late 19th century had to do with physical health and youthful exercise. It was no longer in fashion to have little girls sit around doing nothing. Now they could also be expected to play, climb trees, and explore. It's no surprise then that the subsequent feminist movements during the Roaring Twenties, World War I, and World War II also featured the strong presence of tomboys. I want to emphasize the point that the tomboy is a trope associated with younger characters and younger people. Very rarely is the term assigned to older women. In modern times, the tomboy has become almost like a youthful aesthetic, a phase children are sometimes allowed to entertain before they transition into a proper female identity. Furthermore, tomboys as characters in media have been viewed as icons of feminine defiance, juvenile delinquency, and precursors of sexual deviancy. While the tomboy may have its roots in female empowerment and as a space for women to challenge the boundaries of female gender, it is also more often women in media who most strongly encourage the transition from tomboyness into traditional femininity. Whether they are roguish survivalists like Katniss Everdeen, boy-avoiding intellectuals like Kat Stratford, or the immature, headstrong scout from To Kill a Mockingbird, tomboys in media almost inevitably find themselves pressured and tamed into more traditional roles of femininity, either by other characters in the story or by the narrative itself. All right, with that bit of background fresh in our heads, let's jump into the discussion.
So one interesting concept that I kept coming upon when I was researching the tomboy is the performativeness of gender. This idea that gender is something that we do instead of something that we are. You know, the reason that, not necessarily the reason, but the source of like a lot of girls having a tomboy phase essentially is that they are trying out different gender presentations before naturally being pushed into the quote-unquote right direction.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. It's one of those points that I really came across a lot too, with this idea. I think there's nowadays a movement to sort of get rid of the term tomboy because it really does center and anchor the idea of gender presentation in these sort of binary. Like tomboy implies that you are being more like a man, even though the behaviors of a tomboy, like reading books, running around, climbing trees, are kind of non-gendered. Not kind of, they are non-gendered. And I think that there's sort of this push right now of getting rid of the word tomboy altogether.
Yes, I did come upon that too. This idea that we're moving away from the concept of a tomboy, especially within media presentation, because now the way that gender is depicted is very gradually becoming more nuanced to the point where someone who, you know, behaves or dresses or whatever like a tomboy wouldn't be considered that anymore. Like if you saw someone do that now, you would have, I think, a more in-depth question other than like, oh, she's not acting like a girl. It would just be more of like, well, does she even consider herself a girl? What even is a girl? What do those concepts even mean? There's a quote that I found in one of the articles that I read. She said, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, which really struck with me. And also this idea that the concept of woman, and by extension any gender, is a historical situation rather than a natural fact.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was sort of examining by looking at these different periods of following the 19th century, like this Roaring 20s, World War I, World War II, is that the behaviors of a tomboy has also evolved with the definitions and with the societal constructs of femininity and masculinity. So it used to be more of a being feisty, being loud, verbal in different ways used to be considered what a tomboy was, because it was more associated with this sort of unconstrained social aspect of the male gender. But as we've gotten into sort of the modern era, there's a lot less constricted in the same ways. So as women began attending college in the 1970s and such, the idea of education as a masculine pastime sort of became less and less. So tomboys are no longer associated with the same level of education that they were. Now you can be educated and not a tomboy. Now you can be an activist and not a tomboy. I think that currently one of the debates right now about tomboyism in modern media is the strong association with the trope, very specifically in media, and either gender divergence or sexuality divergence.
I do also think of that a lot, just in terms of, once again, more nuanced portrayals of sexual divergence. But at the same time, there's also a part of me that wonders if that doesn't in a lot of ways leans into the stereotype about sexuality within, this idea that lesbians, for example, will always, present themselves as the tomboy, as the butch, the more mask presenting, even though that's not the case for a lot of people.
I think that there's really a difference in how the tomboy is presented, not so much in the presentation itself, but in the audience it's built for. In real life and in media, there's a large variance of the tomboy trope and of the tomboy aesthetic. Some people who present as tomboy wear feminine clothing but have traditionally masculine identities or behaviors. Some people dress traditionally masculine, like think suit, tie, vest, all the things, but have very feminine personalities. The divergence of what the tomboy means and how it's so strongly associated with this sort of, especially in sitcoms, how it's associated with this sort of butch lesbian identity. People still in TV today make jokes if a character dresses more mask of like, when are you going to get your girlfriend? Who are you going to the prom with? It's still not necessarily identified with the feminine identity. There's still a difference there.
Something I was really interested in when you were doing your introduction was that the tomboy is almost always referred to young girls. You don't see it being used for older girls because you can't be a tomboy anymore. There's this implicit idea of it being something that you grow out of. The thing that I was really thinking about with this idea of the tomboy doesn't grow up is that the perception, or that the way that a tomboy is received when they are older, is so different from when they're younger. Like when they're younger, it's something that's kind of, it's still ill-advised, but it's still kind of tolerated, versus in older women, a lot of times it's almost considered a threat because the tomboy essentially denies the male gaze the chance to sexualize her.
I think that's a really interesting point. So a lot of my focus on this topic was in younger characters, and that does have a lot to do with this idea. You'll see tomboys a lot in media written by both men and women. It's sort of this universal trope because it's tied to this idea of youth that is sort of the same in men and women. Typically, you'll see a lot of tomboys, especially raised by women in real life, not so much media, following feminist movements. And this idea of not allowing the male gaze to sort of swerve to the tomboy, I think that there's a lot of offshoots of where the tomboy goes. But traditionally speaking, as a character trope, this sort of younger character has a very innocent flavoring to it.
I thought it was interesting that you brought up the fact that tomboys are following the feminist movement, because there's this particular wave of feminism that goes against anything feminine, and is like, if you're feminine, then you're not a feminist because you're conforming to this thing. But I was reading for a different project, Ace by Angela Chen, and it talked about the idea of like what liberation means, and she talked about going like acutely against the norm, because she was talking about sexuality and asexuality and how there's a narrative of ace people being repressed, and it's a whole thing. It was kind of interesting. But there's an idea that liberation comes from going acutely against the norm rather than just doing what you actually want to do.
No, I think it's a really interesting idea about acutely going against the norm rather than doing what you want. I do think that within the trope of a tomboy, there's this sort of idea, especially like with these feminist movements, of raising these sort of rambunctious, masculine behaviors into girls and into these sort of like Eloise from Bridgerton, I think of as sort of a modern presentation of this sort of very active counterculture rather than what people sort of want from the tomboy trope. Like if you look at chat rooms or reviews or like book reviews of a more genuine presentation of like what the tomboy looks like in their real life, I think that there's a really interesting conversation about that kind of movement.
It's also one of the defining characteristics of the tomboy is the active rejection of femininity. I think in a lot of ways it stems from the already negative perception towards femininity that society has. Like, you're raised being told you are a girl, but then being a girl is bad, so you don't want to anymore. And I think that's why a lot of narratives present, the tomboy growing up as them essentially accepting their femininity.
To read more about these topics, please visit our website. But for the sake of time, let's move on to our last trope, the cool girl.
In her 2012 best-selling novel, Gone Girl, Gillian Flynn coined the term the cool girl. At the turning point of the story, the character Amy defines the cool girl in an iconic monologue. Nick and Amy will be gone, but then again, they never really existed. Nick loved a girl I was pretending to be. Cool girl. Men always use that, don't they, as their defining compliment? She's a cool girl. Cool girl is hot. Cool girl is game. Cool girl never gets angry at her man. She only smiles in a chagrined, loving manner and lets her man do whatever he wants. Go ahead, shit on me, I don't mind. I'm the cool girl. I have not read the novel, but in the film, this monologue is juxtaposed with scenes of Amy preparing to frame her husband for her disappearance and later death, suggesting to viewers that it is the act of pretending to be this girl that has led to the built-up resentment and frustration filtering to the surface now. This quote, along with a trope analysis from the YouTube channel The Take, come together to form our working definition of the cool girl. The cool girl is a male fantasy that only exists within the media, though many celebrities have donned the persona. She is stereotypically attractive and thin and accomplishes these with an ethereal air of effortlessness. She's interested in cars, sports, Star Wars, or whatever other traditionally masculine interests our protagonist has. She eats whatever she wants, namely junk food, and as much as she wants, and never worries about gaining weight. Basically, she's one of the boys in the body of a beautiful woman. She is unconcerned with feminine pursuits like beauty and love, and instead comes upon them through sheer virtue of her coolness. She does not try, she just is. She's a woman dispossessed of all the characteristics men dislike in women. She's not emotional or clingy, and she does not ask for commitment, better treatment, or respect. She's never angry, and she never challenges the place of women in the patriarchy. She merely asks that she be the exception. She's not like other girls. To name some characters that embody this trope, think Olivia Wilde in Drinking Buddies, Anne Hathaway in Love and Other Drugs, Zooey Deschanel in 500 Days of Summer, Kate Hudson in How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. The list goes on. Typically, this cool girl is juxtaposed with another, more traditionally feminine character who is often depicted as being too uptight, needy, or emotional, and used to critique these characteristics and traditional femininity as a whole and display their undesirability. But, as showcased by Gone Girl and as observed by Helen Coffey at The Telegraph, this cool girl doesn't actually exist, though men have been tricked into believing she does, and women have been tricked into pretending to be her. In discussing Gone Girl, Coffey writes, Amy realizes the cool girl is merely an illusion conjured up by Hollywood to unwittingly torture us all. Women are taught they're never good enough, and men are taught to forever search for a figment of someone else's imagination. So, with some background under our belts, let's jump into discussion.
So, with all the tropes we've been talking about, really, I've been thinking about the not like other girls phenomenon and how that has like different flavors to it that we've kind of talked about. Going back to the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, since I have these in the order that we talked about them, but going back to the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, since she's neurodivergent coded, there's kind of an observational aspect to it sometimes of like, oh, there's something tangibly different here. And then with the tomboy, there's the feminist aspect of like going against what is considered feminine. And then the cool girl, there's this aspect of the not like other girls phenomenon of like realizing your personhood and wanting to be viewed as a person instead of like what we associate with womanhood, which isn't that.
I love that you said that because it was something that I also noticed, that the one overarching theme between all these tropes that we've been discussing, and honestly all of the tropes of depictions of women in general, is that they're kind of presented as one of two things. Either they are a male fantasy, or they are characterized, but the fact that they are characterized, the fact that they have interests, a personality, quite literally anything, makes them be presented as an anomaly, as though they are, like, it is so very rare for a woman to have thoughts and emotions and interests.
And I think maybe the cool girl is kind of both of those, where like she's conventionally attractive, she seems like she'd be traditionally feminine, and so men will gravitate for her, but then she has like secret depth because she has masculine interests, if that makes sense.
Yes, but I'm gonna disagree with you on that, just because one of the defining characteristics of the cool girl, from what I've found, is her lack of depth. Because in a lot of ways, the cool girl she's a mirror, she's a fantasy, she's entirely there to give the male protagonist everything he wants. You know, someone who is interested in whatever he's interested in, someone who will do whatever he wants to do, and on top of that, she's gorgeous.
Yeah, I agree with you. I realized once you started saying that I didn't clarify that like secret depth was meant to kind of be sarcastic, where like she has a personality because she has masculine interests, but she doesn't actually have a personality. Her personality is just like she has one.
So a bunch of the articles I was reading for this also focused on the way that women are essentially tricked into play acting the cool girl. So one of the articles I read was talking about how the cool girl is not just a fiction, but that it's a phase that a lot of women will go through as they're entering into adulthood, like initially pretending to be like this extreme, fun-loving, cheerful, outgoing person. And it's not that you don't necessarily have these character traits. You can, obviously. But another defining trait of the cool girl is that she never gets angry. She never expresses any emotions other than those cool, fun, interesting ones. And with Gone Girl, for example, which is such a perfect example of this, you see the way that ultimately being the cool girl is a really deep form of repression, because you are keeping all of these things about yourself that men would find unattractive buried so deep down in order to present this veneer of like, I'm the cool girl, I don't care.
One thing that I want to amend is not that the cool girl never gets angry. I think it's that she only gets angry for the right reasons.
Say more.
So, for instance, Kate Hudson's character in How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, she is this, I think she's a reporter, this sort of fiery actress in a way. Actress not in the sense of like she's playing a character, but in the sense of she is trying to, throughout the course of the movie, play up her feminine traits. And she gets pissed a lot in the movie whenever he's not falling for it. So it's basically this entire like couple hour sequence of her going on these dates, pretending to be the perfect girl, accidentally dropping in a cool girl trait, like she doesn't watch what she eats, she loves going to like baseball games, all these sorts of things that he's really into, and then her very explosive reaction to not being taken seriously.
You know, if we compare it to current modern times, for example, and the way the dating landscape looks like right now, you can see the cool girl manifesting in hookup culture, because, you know, there's this idea now that it's no longer, you know, no one really wants to like openly ask for commitment. No one wants to openly admit that they want love, they want marriage, they want all of those things. Instead, everyone has this mindset of, oh, I just want something casual and easy. And there is this trend of a lot of women on social media who will talk about engaging in hookup culture, which has been, you know, sold to them as this thing that's empowering, and how it kind of leaves them feeling almost empty and sad and devoid, because they have essentially repressed themselves and downplayed their own feelings by pretending like they don't want what they actually want. And it's like, yes, you get the attention, you get the man, or you get a version of him, but what's the point when you're just pretending the entire time?
I think that one thing that we keep circling back to in a lot of these discussions is the ways that media really influences and enforces these sort of gendered presentations of what we're supposed to want as a specific gender. I think we talked about this a little bit in our masculinity episode, presenting these sort of robust male characters makes men want to behave in this sort of way. And looping back around to this feminist conversation about presenting these women as ideal attraction objects has a lot to do with how our real life is sort of mirroring that. One of the studies that I was looking at by Olivia Josefina and Larson Sauberg, this is an article titled "She's Not Like Other Girls, She's a Cool Girl," talks about the differences between tomboys, pick-me's, and cool girls, and also talks about the ways that both in Europe and the United States, we on average as citizens spend over 3 hours a day consuming media like movies or TV shows. And another thing that I kind of was reading in this differentiation is also who is producing those imageries. So one of the things I looked at was like, what is the percentage of men versus women in media industries? So you don't really see this idea of the cool girl as much. Not that it doesn't exist, but you don't see it as much in written media. Mm-hmm. And that has something to do with the fact that over 50% of writers in the 21st century are women. That is larger than almost any other creative industry. The alternative fact, so another thing to keep in mind is that less than, I think it's around 14% of movie directors are women, and only about 10% of cinematographers are women. It's not necessarily just the fact that this media is meant to influence or present genders certain ways, because it's not necessarily that it's trying to do that. Part of what it is that so much of our media that we see and present is literally from a male gaze. It's 90% of directors who are choosing what the frame looks at and who the characters are. And part of what that does is define what men think of as women who are attractive.
As usual, there is always more to say. For further resources, please visit our website. This will unfortunately be our last episode, but it has been a wonderful time. This is TropeTok.
Thank you.